When the Trump administration unveiled sweeping tariffs in March 2025, targeting Chinese imports with a blunt 20% levy, few anticipated how quickly the retaliation would strike at the heart of American agriculture. Within days, Beijing fired back, not with tanks or missiles, but with something far more devastating to Midwest farmers: a trade embargo. China announced it would halt soybean purchases from 3 major U.S. exporters, sending shockwaves through America's agricultural heartland. But that was only the beginning of the story. In the weeks that followed, Chinese buyers quietly orchestrated one of the largest agricultural pivots in modern trade history. They placed orders for approximately 40 massive cargo vessels, each one loaded to capacity with Brazilian soybeans. The total haul? Around 2.4 million metric tons of golden legumes, scheduled for delivery between May and July. To put that in perspective, this single purchasing spree represents roughly 1/3 of China's typical monthly soybean consumption. The message was unmistakable: America's farmers were being replaced. As tensions between Washington and Beijing continue to intensify, experts now predict that Brazil, already the world's leading soybean producer, could entirely displace the United States as China's primary supplier. For American farmers who have depended on Chinese demand for decades, this shift represents nothing short of an existential crisis. So what does this mean for the future of American agriculture? Can Brazil truly step into the void and replace U.S. exports completely? And most importantly, what will happen to the farmers caught in the crossfire of this escalating trade war? If you want to stay informed about the global economic shifts reshaping our world, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what comes next. Let's dive in. When most people think about the United States economy, their minds immediately jump to technology giants in Silicon Valley, the towering financial institutions of Wall Street, or the glittering entertainment industry centered in Hollywood. These are the sectors that dominate headlines and capture global imagination. But there's another side to America's economic power, one that operates far from coastal cities and rarely makes the front page. It's the vast agricultural machine that spans the nation's interior, turning soil and sunlight into one of the most valuable exports on the planet. The United States isn't just a technological or financial superpower, it's also an agricultural titan, possessing the largest expanse of farmable land anywhere on Earth. We're talking about approximately 2.5 billion mu, that's roughly 410 million acres, of arable territory. This enormous agricultural base is tended by around 2.13 million farmers who work tirelessly to feed not just America, but much of the world. Here's a fact that might surprise you. 3 of the 4 largest grain trading corporations on the planet are American companies. These agricultural giants control supply chains, set global prices, and influence food security decisions in countries across every continent. But today we're focusing on one crop in particular, a crop that has become the unexpected centerpiece of a geopolitical confrontation between the world's 2 largest economies: soybeans. If you were to trace America's soybean production on a map, you'd notice a distinctive pattern. The planting zones form what agricultural scientists call an inverted U-shape, starting in Minnesota's northern prairies, sweeping down through the Mississippi River Valley, then curving eastward toward North Carolina's coastal plains. This region has earned a special designation among farming communities: the Soybean Belt. Stretching across 12 major agricultural states in America's Midwest, this belt represents the most concentrated and productive soybean growing territory in the Western Hemisphere. At its core are 3 powerhouse states: Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota. These 3 alone account for a staggering portion of America's total output. The numbers tell an impressive story. In 2023, American farms harvested approximately 126 million tons of soybeans, making the United States the world's 2nd largest producer. After satisfying domestic demand, which includes everything from cooking oil to animal feed to industrial applications, the country still has an enormous surplus available for international markets. Who buys these American soybeans? The customer list reads like a who's who of global economies. Mexico imports substantial quantities to support its livestock industry. Japan brings in around 2.6 million tons annually for food processing and tofu production. South Korea relies on American beans for similar purposes. Even the European Union, with all its agricultural self-sufficiency, still imports approximately 5.8 million tons from U.S. farms each year. But there was one customer that dwarfed all the others combined, one market that American farmers had come to rely on more than any other: China. There was a time, not so long ago, when the relationship between American soybean farmers and Chinese buyers seemed like a perfect match made in agricultural heaven. Between 2003 and 2013, a period that trade historians now refer to as the Golden Decade, the partnership flourished. China's rapidly growing economy was creating an expanding middle class with changing dietary habits. As Chinese consumers ate more meat, the country needed exponentially more soybeans to produce the animal feed required for its massive livestock operations. The numbers from this era are staggering. In 2003, China imported 16.9 million tons of soybeans from all sources worldwide. Just 10 years later, by 2013, that figure had exploded to 63.4 million tons, a nearly four-fold increase. Throughout this entire period, American soybeans consistently captured about 40% of the Chinese market. For Midwest farmers, this meant prosperity. Equipment could be upgraded, loans could be paid off, children could be sent to college. The Chinese market had become the economic backbone of rural America's agricultural communities. But even the Golden Decade wasn't the peak. The absolute zenith came in 2016, a year that soybean farmers still talk about with a mixture of nostalgia and disbelief. That year, the United States shipped an unprecedented 36.1 million tons of soybeans to China. The total value? $14 billion. This represented a mind-boggling 62% of America's entire soybean export volume. To physically transport this quantity of beans across the Pacific Ocean required the equivalent of roughly 750 massive cargo ships, each one carrying about 50,000 tons. Picture that for a moment, an armada of vessels stretching from American ports to Chinese harbors, creating a continuous bridge of agricultural commerce. For American farmers, 2016 represented the peak of everything they had worked toward. They had no way of knowing that the collapse was already on the horizon. In 2018, when Donald Trump assumed the presidency for his first term, he brought with him an aggressive trade philosophy. His administration believed that China had been exploiting the international trade system, stealing intellectual property, and engaging in unfair practices that harmed American workers and businesses. The solution, according to Trump's team, was simple: impose tariffs. Make Chinese goods more expensive. Force Beijing to negotiate on American terms. What the administration apparently failed to anticipate was how quickly and strategically China would respond, and which American industries would become collateral damage. China's retaliation was precise and devastating. Rather than imposing broad tariffs that might hurt Chinese consumers, Beijing targeted specific American exports with surgical precision. Agricultural products, particularly soybeans, became ground zero for China's counteroffensive. The logic was ruthless but effective. Soybean farmers were concentrated in Midwestern states that had voted heavily for Trump. By inflicting economic pain on these communities, China calculated that it could create domestic political pressure on the Trump administration to reconsider its strategy. The impact was immediate and brutal. According to research I've examined, between 2019 and 2024, America's share of the Chinese soybean market plummeted from around 40% to less than 30%. For an industry that had become dependent on Chinese demand, this represented a catastrophic loss. Billions of dollars in export revenue simply evaporated. Farm bankruptcies began mounting across the Midwest. Commodity prices dropped as American beans piled up in storage facilities with nowhere to go. The Trump administration attempted to cushion the blow by providing direct payments to farmers, essentially government subsidies to offset the losses from the trade war. But these payments couldn't replace a functioning market relationship. Still, as difficult as 2018 to 2024 had been for American agriculture, farmers held out hope that tensions would eventually ease. Perhaps a new administration would restore trade relationships. Perhaps Beijing would ultimately need American soybeans again. Those hopes were about to be crushed. March 2025. The second trade war begins. When Trump returned to office and announced a new 20% tariff on Chinese goods in March 2025, the agricultural community watched with dread. They had lived through this nightmare before. They knew what was coming. China's response arrived with stunning speed. The General Administration of Customs in Beijing issued a formal announcement. 3 American agricultural companies were immediately losing their authorization to export soybeans to China. The stated reason? Quality control failures. Chinese inspectors had allegedly discovered harmful substances, including ergot toxins and problematic seed-coating chemicals, in shipments from these companies. According to Chinese officials, these contaminants posed potential health risks and were therefore unacceptable. Whether these quality concerns were legitimate or simply convenient justification for political retaliation is a matter of debate. What wasn't debatable was the practical effect. A significant portion of American soybean exports to China had just been shut down overnight. For context, consider this. In 2024, China purchased 52% of all American soybean exports. That's more than half of the entire international market for U.S. beans flowing to a single customer. When that customer suddenly stops buying, the entire industry goes into crisis mode. The American Soybean Association, the industry's main lobbying group, quickly commissioned studies to project the damage. Their findings were grim. If tensions continued to escalate, soybean exports to China could collapse by 40% or more during 2025. The financial devastation would ripple across the entire agricultural economy, and the casualties were already beginning to mount. By spring 2025, 88 farms across the Midwest had already filed for bankruptcy protection, unable to survive the combination of low prices, high costs, and vanishing export markets. In Illinois, one of the heart states of soybean production, a farmer named Johnson sat down with his accounting books and did the brutal math. His production costs had climbed to over $600 per acre, covering seeds, fertilizer, fuel, equipment, insurance, and labor. But with market prices depressed and Chinese buyers gone, his revenue per acre had stagnated around $500. He was losing $100 on every acre he planted. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Johnson or his neighbors. Trump's America First policies, promoted under the banner of making America great again, were instead functioning like a noose around the necks of the very farmers who had supported him most loyally. But here's the thing that made this crisis even more devastating for American agriculture. China wasn't suffering. In fact, Chinese consumers and businesses barely noticed the disruption because China had found a replacement supplier, one that was bigger, closer, and increasingly eager to fill the void America left behind. Enter Brazil, the agricultural powerhouse. While American farmers watched their export markets crumble, their competitors in South America were experiencing unprecedented growth. Brazil has emerged as one of the most formidable agricultural nations on Earth. In 2024, Brazilian farms produced approximately 160 million tons of soybeans, surpassing even the United States to claim the title of world's largest producer. The planting area devoted to soybeans in Brazil now exceeds 38 million hectares, concentrated primarily in the states of Mato Grosso, Paraná, and Goiás. What makes Brazil such an ideal soybean producer? The answer lies in geography and climate. About 1/3 of Brazil's territory consists of plains and plateaus, vast, flat expanses perfectly suited for mechanized, large-scale agriculture. Unlike the varied terrain of many countries, these Brazilian landscapes allow for efficient planning, maintenance, and harvesting with modern equipment. Then there's the climate. Situated primarily in tropical and subtropical zones, Brazil receives abundant rainfall and consistent sunshine throughout the growing season. Soybeans thrive in these conditions, producing high yields with relatively modest inputs compared to farming in more temperate regions. But Brazil's advantages extend beyond just production capacity. Timing matters enormously in global commodity markets, and here again, Brazil holds a crucial edge. The Brazilian soybean harvest season aligns almost perfectly with China's peak demand periods. When Chinese crushers and processors need fresh supplies, Brazilian beans are ready to ship. This synchronization creates a natural commercial relationship that requires no complex logistics to manage seasonal mismatches. The statistics illuminate Brazil's dominance. In 2024, Brazil exported soybeans to China at a rate 3.5 times higher than American exports. Brazilian beans accounted for roughly 76% of all soybeans entering Chinese ports that year. When you control 3/4 of the world's largest market, you're not just a major player, you're effectively the market. And the trajectory continues upward. Projections suggest that by 2025, Brazil's annual soybean production could exceed 180 million tons, further cementing its position as the indispensable supplier for Chinese demand. Looking at the data from 2019 through 2024, a clear pattern emerges. Brazilian soybeans have consistently represented 70% or more of China's total soybean imports year after year. What began as China's strategy to diversify away from American dependence has evolved into a fundamental restructuring of global agricultural trade flows. From China's perspective, the shift makes perfect strategic sense. Why maintain reliance on a supplier whose government repeatedly uses trade access as a political weapon? Why tolerate the uncertainty of whether American beans will be available next month or next year, depending on the latest diplomatic spat? Brazil, by contrast, has proven to be a stable, reliable, and enthusiastic partner. In mid-April 2025, a scene unfolded at the port of Santos in Brazil that would have been, honestly, unthinkable just a decade earlier. 40 massive cargo vessels sat anchored or docked at the sprawling port facility, each one in the process of loading soybeans destined for China. The total cargo? Approximately 2.4 million tons, an astronomical quantity representing one of the largest single agricultural shipments in recent history. These weren't emergency purchases or spot market transactions. Chinese buyers had secured these beans through long-term supply contracts covering deliveries from May through July. The timing was strategic, carefully planned to avoid the period when new American soybeans would typically hit the market, ensuring that Chinese demand would be entirely satisfied by Brazilian supply. For American farmers watching this unfold, the implications were, well, devastating. The order represented roughly $1.1 billion in sales that would have gone to U.S. farms if not for the ongoing trade conflict. That money would have supported thousands of farming families, local businesses, equipment dealers, and rural communities across the Midwest. Instead, it went to Brazil. Social media reactions captured the bitter irony. The harder Washington swings its tariff stick, one observer noted, the faster the cranes turn at Brazilian ports. It was a crude summary, but, accurate. China's investment in Brazilian agricultural infrastructure tells you everything you need to know about Beijing's long-term strategy. In 2023, Chinese companies and financial institutions participated in a 4 billion yuan investment to expand and modernize the port of Santos, specifically its agricultural export terminals. These new facilities officially began operations at the end of March 2025, just as the latest trade tensions were escalating. The improvements weren't merely cosmetic. The upgraded port infrastructure reduced shipping times for soybeans from Brazil to China from 45 days down to approximately 30 days. Transportation costs per ton dropped by about 90 yuan, a significant reduction when you're moving millions of tons annually. Faster shipments mean fresher products, lower inventory costs, and more efficient supply chains. But the cooperation extends even beyond port infrastructure. China and Brazil have developed what industry analysts call a soybeans for infrastructure partnership model. Brazilian agricultural revenues, generated substantially from soybean exports to China, are being reinvested in expanding Brazil's rail network, improving transportation from interior farming regions to coastal ports. Chinese construction companies and financing institutions are deeply involved in these infrastructure projects. It's a virtuous cycle from both countries' perspectives. China gets reliable, cost-effective food supplies while simultaneously expanding economic influence in Latin America. Brazil gets capital investment, infrastructure modernization, and guaranteed demand for its primary agricultural export. For the United States, watching from the sidelines, this strategic partnership represents something far more troubling than simple lost sales. It's the emergence of an alternative global economic architecture, one that excludes American participation. Trump's tariff strategy was premised on the assumption that China would have no choice but to accept American terms because alternatives didn't exist. The rapid expansion of Brazil-China agricultural integration proves that assumption catastrophically wrong. Beyond soybeans, the corn crisis. If the soybean story weren't alarming enough for American agriculture, there's, another crop following a similar trajectory: corn. China is one of the world's largest corn consumers, requiring massive imports to supplement domestic production. For years, American corn farmers enjoyed substantial export sales to Chinese buyers, particularly for high-quality corn used in livestock feed and food processing. But those sales have collapsed alongside soybeans. Consider these numbers. In August 2024, the United States exported just 240,000 tons of corn to China. Compare that to August 2022, when exports reached 1.5 million tons. We're talking about an 83% decline in just 2 years. While American corn shipments to China haven't been completely eliminated, unlike soybeans, where some companies have lost export authorization entirely, the trend line points unmistakably downward. And once again, Brazil stands ready to fill the gap. Brazil is already the world's second-largest corn exporter, trailing only the United States. But historically, China didn't import Brazilian corn at all. For 9 consecutive years leading up to 2024, not a single ton of Brazilian corn entered Chinese ports. Phytosanitary regulations, quality standards, and simply the lack of established trade relationships kept this market closed. That's now changing. As the trade war intensifies, Chinese agricultural authorities are rapidly approving Brazilian corn for import, establishing the regulatory frameworks and inspection protocols necessary to facilitate large-scale trade. The infrastructure being built to handle Brazilian soybeans can easily accommodate corn shipments as well. For American corn farmers, this represents the nightmare scenario they saw play out with soybeans, now repeating itself with another major crop. Once Chinese buyers establish reliable relationships with Brazilian suppliers, once the logistics are worked out, the contracts are signed, and the supply chains are functioning, there's very little incentive to return to American sources, even if trade tensions eventually ease. Market share, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to recapture. The human cost. Farmers caught in the crossfire. Behind all these statistics and trade figures are real people. Farmers who've worked their land for generations, who've invested their life savings in equipment and seeds, who've built their futures around the expectation that hard work and quality products would ensure success. For these farming families, the trade war isn't an abstract geopolitical contest. It's an existential threat. The 88 farm bankruptcies reported by mid-2025 represent just the visible tip of a much larger crisis. Many more farms are technically insolvent, but haven't yet formally filed for bankruptcy, hoping desperately that conditions will improve before they're forced to liquidate. Others are surviving only through emergency loans, selling off equipment or taking outside employment to supplement farming income that no longer covers basic expenses. The psychological toll is immense. Rural suicide rates, already elevated compared to urban areas, have climbed further as financial stress compounds the isolation and uncertainty that many farmers face. Mental health services in agricultural communities are overwhelmed, struggling to provide support to populations that have traditionally been reluctant to seek help. Local businesses that depend on farming communities are suffering collateral damage. Equipment dealers can't sell new machinery when farmers can't afford to buy. Feed suppliers, seed companies, fertilizer distributors, all are experiencing declining sales. Small-town banks that have extended agricultural loans are nervously watching their portfolios, knowing that widespread farm failures could trigger cascading financial problems. The cruel irony that Farmer Johnson identified, that policies ostensibly designed to protect American interests are instead destroying American livelihoods, resonates throughout agricultural communities. Many of these farmers voted for Trump precisely because of his promises to be tough on China, to fight for American industries, to prioritize American workers. Now they're discovering that in complex global markets, tariffs function less like precision weapons and more like bombs that destroy everything in their blast radius, including the people you're trying to protect. Can the United States recover lost ground? This raises a critical question. Is the damage permanent? If trade tensions eventually ease, whether through negotiated agreements, political changes, or simple economic necessity, can American agriculture recapture the Chinese market share it's lost? The honest answer is sobering. Probably not entirely, and possibly not at all,